to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true, with thanksgiving. I'll be a living sanctuary for you. Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I am listening to A Sanctuary by Mecca King, and I'm going to give a couple of more minutes for some more people to pop on as we explore manipulative communication. Pure and holy, tried and true, with thanksgiving, I'll be a living sanctuary for you. We're going to go ahead and get started. Let us begin with the word of prayer. Oh, gracious and holy God, our Creator, we thank you. We thank you for this time of gathering to come together to hear a word from you, to learn that we may be better, dear God, in our communication. God, I pray and I thank you for all things. In your Son, Jesus the Christ. Amen. This week, we are going to discuss manipulative communication. And manipulative communication is the interactional practice, meaning someone with influence who's able to influence others to manipulate and exercise, meaning to have control over the other. And a lot of times, this control or this manipulation, when it comes to communication, is that from an emotional point of view. And the person, the receiver of the communication, is unaware, right? They're unaware of that person's intentions towards them. They're unaware that that person that's delivering the message desires for them to give in what they want and desire. And so the goal of someone who uses this type of communication is to achieve control over, to get what they want from that person whom they are communicating with, right? They want to persuade. Their focus is simply on the other person, meeting their needs, meeting their wants, meeting their desires, and getting what they want from the other person. So they use language to help maximize or to influence the message that the receiver is getting from them. Now, why is this important? This is important because remember, we communicate to learn, right? And so if someone comes into a conversation mainly with the focus on them and what they want, it denies the other person to be able to share what they want, to share what they think, to share their feelings, right? So the one that's doing the talking, the one that's giving the message, is the one that's in control and dominating the conversation, and the receiver is the one that's being manipulated, right? This causes the receiver of the message to critically analyze what's being said, right? And a lot of times this has to do with whatever the message is. So, whatever the person that's delivering the message, what is it that they want? How are they pulling the strings of the person that is supposed to be in communication with them, the one that's receiving the message? Right. So they desire to influence the decision maker of the receiver of the message. And they do this in a way to use language to make the one that's receiving the message, they make them feel guilty. They may make them critically examine their thoughts or their feelings or where they are at in the conversation. And a lot of times, the one that's delivering the message is really using the technique of blaming, getting the one that's receiving the message to fall into line what they want. Because remember, their whole goal and purpose is to receive what they want. So, someone who uses this style of communication really victimizes the one that's receiving the message, victimizes, right? They have a hidden agenda. Their overall goal is to have power over and to control the person and the way that the conversation goes. And this can impact the belief system. So let's say me being a victim survivor of trauma, if someone was to come to me, depending on the language that they use, they can manipulate me because of my experience of trauma. So they can re-victimize me if they say, if you don't, or you always, they use specific language to get me to feel guilty, right? And because I already have an underlying history of trauma, it can cause me to revert to give this person what they want so that I don't feel the way that they're causing me to feel, right? Because you want that conversation to end, right? And so a lot of times the only way that the conversation can end is if you give the one that's delivering the message, who is the manipulator, what they want. And a lot of times there are similarities between this type of style and the passive aggressive style. So, manipulative communication is more gradual, but it's more harmful than the conversation that can be had between a passive aggressive person, right? Because the underlying goal is to cause someone to feel guilt or to cause someone to feel ashamed. Whatever tactic they use is used for them to gain control and power, for them to gain what they want, their outcome. It's not a braided dialogue. It's not focused on communicating to learn, right? Because there's deceit, right? The motives are not pure. They're going to this person so this person can give in to what they want. They're not concerned with what the other person wants, what the other person thinks, what the other person's desire. The whole dialogue or the conversation is focused on the one delivering the message and using the tactic of being manipulative, right? And so they focus and they cause the person that's in the conversation, the one that's receiving the message, to internalize their anger, their frustration, their guilt, and it causes them to be emotionally drained. How many of us have been in conversations with someone who used this type of communication style and caused us to be drained emotionally because their tactics were cunning, right? Their tactics were cunning because they were solely focused on receiving from us for them getting their way. Never mind what we think. Never mind if we had something to share to bring to the conversation. This type of dialogue is normally shut down because that person is so focused on them, right? And a lot of times when we're in relationships and we experience this type of communication, it hinders the relationship from being, the conversation from being healthy, because the conversation is one-sided, right? There's no learning going forth, there's no connecting going forth. It's solely about the one delivering the message that desires a specific outcome that suits only them. So, someone who uses this method of communication is solely focused on them. It's solely focused on their needs and what they want and what they can get. And a lot of times they can use sarcasm, um, whatever they can do to maybe even cause you to be confused or cause you to become emotionally drained. The speaker is delivering a message with hidden motives. They can dance around the subject matter to kind of dress it up in a sense so that they can get what they want. Mai says, I have definitely experienced this type of communication. And she asks, do narcissists typically use this tactic? And I would say yes, because a narcissist is so in tune to themselves. They're not concerned about anyone else. They're only concerned about them and their needs. And this can really harm a relationship, because if you are married, so to speak, or if you're in a committed relationship and one person is using emotional tactics or using the method of blaming or using whatever they can to con or deceive you to get what they want, then it demonstrates that they're not really focused on what's best for the relationship. They're not focused on hearing what you have to say. Rather, they're only focused on their own needs, right? They're not focused on your authentic feelings. They're not focused on what you think. They can only see what's in front of them. And what's in front of them is them getting their needs met. That's what they're focused on. And a lot of times, this style of communication happens in relationships. So, whether it be a work relationship, whether it be the dynamics between a parent and a child, whether it be the dynamics between spouses, whether it be the dynamics between people who are dating, anyone can use this style of communication. And a lot of times, especially when we're looking at the parent child dynamic, the parent simply wants the child to do what the parent wants the child to do, right? And so, how many of us are guilty of using manipulation in order to get our child or our children to do what we desire for them to do, right? But a healthier way of communicating, on which we'll talk about next week, is assertive communication, right? Our communication should be direct and honest. We should not be using statements that cause the other person who's receiving the message to feel guilty or to feel ashamed or to feel victimized or for them to feel that their feelings are negated. Rather, we should be direct, number one, and we should be honest. So if it's something that I want, for example, from my husband, I should be able to go to my husband and state, I want or I need, without trying to be cunning or deceitful in order for him to give me what I want, without being straightforward, right? And a lot of times, another thing that happens in this style of communication is when we focus on the self, we negate the importance of the relationship. We negate the feelings and the thoughts and the opinions of the other person who's the receiver of the message. So, a healthier way to communicate would be to be honest and to be upfront, not to focus on you and your needs and your wants and your desire, but be able to focus on what's best. What do you want the person to learn? Do you want them to be receptive of what you're sharing, or you're not concerned and you only want what you want, right? We don't want to use blaming language, because that is unhealthy. We don't want to tear down a person or to make them feel guilty in order to get what we desire from that person. If we want something from our children, we should be able to say, Tom, I want you to go and clean the kitchen, right? Not say, if you don't clean the kitchen, blah, 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 blah. That's unhealthy, right? And a lot of times, many of us have operated from this point of view, maybe because we learned it, right? Not recognizing that it is unhealthy, right? A healthier way would be to be direct and honest. So instead of pointing the finger, instead of using language that blames and tear down, just be honest, right? Because the purpose of communicating is that we communicate to learn. We want to be able to connect with the receiver. We want to be able to connect with the other. So it's important, rather than trying to manipulate and control, rather than using deceit or being cunning, we need to be open, we need to be honest, and we need to be flexible in our conversation. We don't want to use violence. We don't want to use aggression, right? We should be able to communicate directly what our needs are from the other person, the one that's receiving the message, without causing them to internalize their feelings, right? Their feelings of, because you're making them feel guilty. Why would we want someone to do something for us and we've guilted them into doing it? Right? Especially in relationships, we want the other, the one that's receiving the message, to do it from their heart. We don't want to use deceit to be able to get our own way, right? And most importantly, we want to have a braided dialogue. We want to hear from the other. We want to know what they think. We want to be able to connect with the other, right? Because the conversation should be benefiting both the one that's giving the message and the receiver, right? And the braided dialogue allows for each person involved to be the messenger and to be the receiver, right? And that's why the dialogue is braided, because it's going back and forth. It's not one sided. One person is not dominating the conversation to get what they want. Rather, they're talking and they're listening. They're hearing from the other, and they're making space to be able to value what the other is saying and taking their feelings and their thoughts into consideration, which is opposite of someone who uses manipulation during the conversation. Because when you do this, you're not concerned with the other. You're not concerned with the other's thoughts, what they want, or what they feel, right? Tell me, put your thoughts in the chat. Tell me if you experience this type of dialogue, or if you yourself have participated unawarely of being um, doing this style of communication, which is manipulative communication. Shakita says, yes, most of the time it is a learned behavior. Absolutely. Shakita, is it is a learned behavior. That's why it's important for us, when we learn better, we do better. And so we model. We have the obligation and the responsibility, especially as parents, to be able to model healthy communication, effective communication that allows all parties involved to be heard, all parties involved, thoughts and feelings to be acknowledged and honored, and allow the dialogue to continue. Shima says manipulative communication is a turn off for me in any relationship, be it family, platonic, romantic, or even work relationships. I talk to manipulative people as little as possible if I can. And you're right, it is a turn off, right? Because a lot of times when people encounter this style, this method of communication, you shut down. And you shut down because number one, you're not being valued. You're not being valued because your thoughts and your feelings are not taken into consideration. And a lot of times, this style of communication, this person is dominating and controlling the conversation. And how many of us know you cannot have a conversation if it's just one person? It takes two to be able to communicate, because we communicate to learn, we communicate to connect with the other, right? We should not be communicating just to get what we want. We should not be communicating to tear down. We should not be communicating to make others feel guilty, right? We should not be communicating that cause persons to be re-traumatized, right? And we can look at this style of communication at different levels, right? We see this style of communication in religion. We see this style of communication in families. We see this style of communication in the workplace. We see this style of communication in politics, right? We should not be fearing or causing people to have fear, right? When we're communicating with them, we want people to make a conscious decision. We want people to be able to express openly what they feel and what they think without there being ramifications, without them being threatened, right? And knowing that it's okay for you to feel how you feel and for you to think how you think, and continue the conversation to learn from the other. And that's the goal of communication. Is to learn from the other, is to connect, right? We want to be able to deepen relationships, not tear down relationships because one person wants to be in control or dominate another person, right? And so we're going to talk about assertive communication next week, because that's the healthier form of communication rather than using manipulation to get or pull what we want from the other person. We should be able to be honest and open in our conversations with those whom we are in relationship, whether it be at home with our significant other, whether it be in no matter what our faith denomination or tradition is, whatever it is, we should be able to completely be our authentic self and share what we feel and share what we think, right? And learn from the other, right? And so when if you can shift or reframe from this style of communication and try to develop assertive communication, then you're able to be direct. You don't use emotional language to pull on the strings of the other to get what you want, because you're not focused on getting your own way. Your focus on, or your desire is for the other person, the one that's receiving the message, is for them to receive what you're sharing and to be able to give you feedback, to be able to braid the dialogue, to be able to interject what they feel and what they think, and to allow the conversation to continue. That's how you connect. And that's how you learn from one another. Shima says, I call this style of communication the used car salesman. That is funny, right? Because we shouldn't be trying to sell anybody junk, right? We shouldn't be using language or words just to manipulate someone to buy into what we're selling. Just be honest and direct, and then you give that person the opportunity to choose, to make a decision, right? We want people to make their own choices and their own decisions. And that's how we connect in relationships, because we're real, we're honest, we're authentic, right? We're direct. We're not focused on our tone or our body language to try to intimidate. Rather, our tone and our body language is used to draw the other in. It's used to connect with the other, right? This allows for each person to be seen. This allows for each person to be equal in the sharing. And this allows for each person to be valuable, right? We are all valuable when we come to the conversation. One person is not better than the other, even in a parent child dynamic. Children have thoughts, and they have feelings. And it's important that we model for them healthy ways of communicating, right? Rather than manipulation. And sometimes as a parent, again, we do what we learned, right? But when we know better, we can learn how to better communicate with our children, with our spouse, on our job, right? Because we have an identity, an authentic self that we want to hold as valuable. So we want to be able to hold the other as valuable too. And so, an example of manipulative conversation is using absolute statements like, you never, as you pointing your finger in their face, or it's all your fault, or you made me do it, right? That's an example of manipulative conversation when you are being aggressive in tone, you're being aggressive with your body language, your whole demeanor is shifted to be able to intimidate the other rather than invite the other into this space where the both of you can share, where the both of you can be the messenger and the both of you can be the receiver of the message, right? So you don't want to focus on controlling the other. You want to focus on inviting the other in. You don't want to focus on being the one that dominates and controls the conversation. You want to focus on hearing and valuing the other, especially in relationships, right? How many of us know that it can turn quick, right? You can be in a situation having a conversation, and if someone that uses this style of communication begins to blame, begins to raise their tone, begins to become aggressive, it can turn, right? And so we don't want situations to turn and to become unhealthy. We want to be mindful of our language. We want to be mindful of our nonverbal communication, which is our body language. We want to be mindful that our motives are pure when we go into the conversation. We are not focused on they're going to do what I said they're going to do, right? We don't want that. That's unhealthy. We want to be able to invite others into the conversation so that we can learn from the other. We want to have a posture that's open and inviting. This allows the one that's receiving the message in that moment when you're the messenger to be receptive, to be able to hear what you have to share, right? Because again, we communicate to learn. So we want to be intentional about not going into the conversation with motives that are selfish or motives that are purely focused on what we want and what we desire. And at the same time, when we do that, we negate the other person. So we don't want to negate anyone. We want to be able to hear. We want to be able to receive. We want to be able to connect. We want to be able to learn from the other. So, another example of manipulative conversation and communication is when we gaslight people or when we approach conversation in an aggressive manner, when we are dishonest, when we lie and we try to get people on our side, when we use our children as pawn in a relationship for the child to get on one side of the parent. That all of that is manipulation and all of it is unhealthy, right? Shima says, I've always been assertive with my son, but for some reason, when he was around 13 years of age, he began trying to use manipulative communication on me. I saw through it every time. It was very frustrating. And sadly, a lot of children do learn how to manipulate very early, right? Because once we give in to that style, then they're going to want to continue to do it. That's why it's important when you are in a relationship and you witness or you experience this type of communication to shut it down. Because the moment you give in, that person is going to continue to use this style of communication to get what they want because you gave in, right? And what I'm suggesting and encouraging is to develop a more healthier approach when you communicate with the other, right? And that is assertive communication when you're able to be direct and when you're able to be honest and you use I statements, right? You're not using you, you're not blaming, you are not using all statements as to say, all the time you do this, all the time this happens because of you. You made me do this. A healthier method would be I feel when you state, so you're putting it back on you, you are acknowledging how you feel. And then you're giving the other person who's receiving the message the opportunity to respond to what you're feeling and to acknowledge what you're feeling and begin the braided dialogue. Because how can we move forward in unhealthy relationships because of communication? And so it's kind of challenging to move forward when there is no healthy communication, where one person is dominating the conversation. Only one person gets to share what they feel or what they think, what they need, and what they desire. And the other person's thoughts and feelings are negated and left outside of the conversation. And so all of this is very important, right? Because we want to build relationships. We want healthy relationships. We want healthy children, right? And so now we have an opportunity to model something different. We have the opportunity to reframe how we think about when we go into a conversation to try to get what we want. Our motives are not pure, and we're being intentional about only getting what we want and what we desire. We're going into the conversation like that, and that's unhealthy. And if we was honest with ourselves, we would be able to admit when we go into conversations where our motives are not pure. We have an agenda, our agenda, and that's the only agenda, is to get what we want, right? We're not there to invite, we're not there to connect, we're not there for the other to learn. We go into this style of communication using deceit and trying to con the other or use emotional language and tactics in order to get what we want. So I want to encourage each of us to be mindful of our motives and be accountable for our language, right? When we are accountable of our language and we're able to recognize, okay, why am I not able to just go and state what I need from this person or what I want or what I desire? This allows you to have some introspection with going on within, like what are you feeling, what are you thinking, that you feel like you have to manipulate this person in order for them to do what you want them to do. And that's important, especially in relationships, because we have to be mindful of the dynamic. Is the dynamic adult to adult, or do you want the dynamic to be spouse, parent to child? You want the spouse to really be your child because you want to tell them what to do, or you want them to hear only from your perspective while you're not being receptive to hear what they think or what they feel, right? So in a relationship, there is no parent child relationship when it comes to adult age persons, whether you married or in a committed relationships. You are two adults equal in the relationship, right? And so the both of you should be able to come to the other and be honest and open and direct, and not try to use power to assert what you feel and what you think and what you believe over the other, right? But rather make space to hear one another and have a braided dialogue that goes back and forth. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And if you don't take away anything else from this week 4, as we explored manipulative communication, I want you to remember, number one, we communicate to learn. Number two, we communicate to connect. And number three, we want to be able to create space to connect for people to receive the message, right? We don't want to cause people to shut down. We don't want to cause people to feel victimized. We don't want people who we are conversating with to think that they don't matter or that they're not valuable. And we don't, most importantly, we don't want people to walk away feeling ashamed or guilty because we use emotional language or tactics to get what we want. Rather, we want to be honest and we want to be direct. The way that we can have control in a conversation is being responsible and aware of our language, aware and responsible for our posture, aware and being able to present what we say in our nonverbal communication in a way that the other person is able to receive it and learn. Because what is the purpose of going to someone to communicate if you're the only one talking and you don't make space to hear the other's thoughts, the other's opinions, the other's feelings? But I want to thank you for tuning in, and tune in next week as we discuss a healthy form of communication. We hinted on it tonight, which is assertive communication. This type of communication is direct and honest, right? Remember, we don't want to use manipulation when we communicate. Don't matter if it's your spouse, your partner, your child, on your job, no matter what situation or circumstances that you are in. You don't want to manipulate someone or use tactics, emotional tactics to get what you want. We want people to do or respond to us from a good place, from their heart. We want people to learn what we have to say and embrace what we have to say, and in return we provide the same thing to them. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you next week as we explore assertive communication. Thanks for tuning in and be blessed.